Hi everyone, it's Lisa. In today's video, I'm going to be making some snowflake theme winter cards using some products from Scrapbook.com. I actually created this video for them for their Christmas in July series, and they recently showed it on their channel. So if you happen to be a subscriber of theirs, you may have already seen this video. So I want to start out by showing you some products from Scrapbook.com that I will be using in this video. And I will have links to all of these products in the description box below. So the first product that I'm showing here is a Scrapbook.com exclusive stamp, and this is their Slimline Snowflake background stamp. This is a brand new stamp to Scrapbook.com. And it is a large snowflake background stamp that will fit on a slimline card front. So the actual snowflake background portion of this stamp, it measures 3.5 inches by 8.5 inches. And the sentiment Ho 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 is a separate sentiment stamp, and that measures approximately 2 3/8 by 3 1/4. And you can see how large these letters are, and there's also some fun designs in the letters. So some of them have dots and others of them have little leaves with the little hearts inside. So a very large sentiment that can be used in conjunction with this background stamp. I'm also going to be using this Scrapbook.com Snowflake Stencil. It is a 6x8 stencil, perfect for your winter cards or scrapbook layouts. I will also be using the Scrapbook.com Vintage Type Lowercase Alphabet stamp. There are also some symbols there at the bottom of that stamp set, and this is perfect if you have a sentiment but not quite the stamp set that says perfectly what you want to say. You can always create your own sentiment with these alphabet individual letter stamps. I'm also going to be using the Scrapbook.com Smooth Cardstock. It comes in a variety of color packs, and this is the cool color pack. So there's a lot of the greens and the blues and the purples in this pack. And this pack is perfect for slimline cards. So the paper is actually 3.5 inches by 8.5 inches, fits perfectly on a slimline card front. You get 40 sheets total, 5 sheets of each of the colors. And here is a pack of Scrapbook.com Nina Solar White Ultra Thick Slimline Cards and Envelopes. It is a 10 pack. You get 10 of each. So you get 10 envelopes as well as 10 card bases, and these are slimline size. So they measure 3.5 by 8.5 inches, and they are 110-pound paper weight. So it's perfect for your slimline card bases, and then you have the envelopes that are included. These scissors are brand new to Scrapbook.com, and they come in two different sizes. They come in the 4-inch and the 5-inch, and these are the 5-inch scissors. These are stainless steel scissors, and I did use these making some cards in this video, and I was able to cut through adhesive, and I did not get any adhesive stuck to the blade, which was awesome. I'm also going to be bringing in some Scrapbook.com white pigment ink, as well as the metallic frost ink pads, and the Scrapbook.com ink blending tools, which have this Velcro attached to the bottom of them, and the foam daubers come off so that you can change them out when you're wanting to use a different color ink. For my first set of cards, I'm going to be making these slimline cards using the Scrapbook.com Snowflake background stamp. So I'm also using my Misty because when I'm using a background stamp, I want to be sure that I get a good impression. So using the Misty or any other stamping platform, it just helps with that. I did use some tape and just put it at the back of that cardstock, and I'm just inking up this stamp using some of the white pigment ink from Scrapbook.com. I want you to notice that I placed that paper right at the 5-inch mark, and then that will allow me, just so that I know if I want to continue to make multiple cards like this, that I can leave my stamp on my Misty door, and I can just replace the paper and just make sure that each color that I want to stamp out is placed at that same 5-inch mark. I don't show it here on the video, but that's how you can go about it if you want to make multiple cards. Just continue to place the paper at the same position in the Misty. So you can see here what the background looks like without adding some embossing powder. It's a little bit lighter. It still shows up. You don't need to use the embossing powder, but I just wanted to give this a little bit of a brighter white color. So I just sprinkled some white embossing powder over top of that ink. Now the white pigment ink, because it is a pigment ink, it does take a little while to dry. So that allows me to actually put on some embossing powder over top of this background. The embossing powder will stick to the ink, and then I'll just take my heat tool and I will run it over the top. It will take just a little bit to heat emboss all of this because it's such a large background, so I'm just going to speed through this process and you can see what the finished product looks like. Next, I take some of that white pigment ink and I stamp it onto an acrylic block. I spritz it with water, and then I'll take a paintbrush and just dab the edge of the paintbrush into that paint mixture, and I'll just flick it on to that card front. And that just gives a little bit of a paint splatter look, which makes it look like falling snow. And if you want to handle this card front right away, you'll want to make sure you take a heat tool and dry it. Otherwise, you can just set it aside and let it dry on its own. Next, I'm going to start working on the sentiment. So I take the same color cardstock and I place it in my MISTI and place the stamp Ho 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 on top. And I'm going to use the same white pigment ink to ink that up. And then I'm going to stamp that down on that cardstock. Press that down really well. And then I'm going to put some white embossing powder over the top of that. And then I will take my heat tool and I will heat set that embossing powder. And just like with the snowflake background stamp set, using the embossing powder, you don't have to use it. It just gives a brighter white look to the stamp set. So I cut down the sentiment to 2 5/8 by 3 3/8. I also have a piece of the lighter green cardstock, and that measures 2 3/4 by 3 1/2. And then I have a piece of white cardstock that measures 2 7/8 by 3 5/8. So next I'm just going to apply all these layers together. So I'm going to add the Ho 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 to the top of the green layer, and then that will be added to the top of the white layer. I also cut down 3 strips of the same light green cardstock that I used in this sentiment piece, and those strips measure 1/2 inch by 3 1/4 inches. And mine show a little bit longer than 3 1/4 inches, but eventually I will cut those down, just snipping off the excess on that snowflake pattern cardstock. Now I do want to mention that I did trim down my snowflake panel to 3 1/4 inches by 8 1/4 inches. So I'm just laying down those 3 strips of cardstock in the center of that snowflake panel. They're going to go right underneath the Ho 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 sentiment. So I'm just trying to measure out to make sure everything is centered before I glue them down. And since my strips were slightly larger than that panel, I did just flip that over and just trim off the excess. So here I'm going to go ahead and add some double-sided foam adhesive. This is the Scrapbook.com double-sided foam adhesive. And I'm just going to add several strips to the back of this sentiment panel. And once I have all of those strips on there, I will add this to the front of that card front. I'm going to take a large piece of the Slimline cardstock in the same green color that I used for the strips underneath the sentiment. And that light green paper I cut down to 3 3/8 by 8 3/8, and I just added the snowflake paper to the top of that, and then I'm going to use some tape and then add that to one of the Slimline card bases from Scrapbook.com. I'm going to take my pops of color in the seafoam and I'm just going to add them to the centers of the snowflakes on the front of this card, just to add a little bit of dimension to it. And when you're using the pops of color, just squeeze out a little bit. They are wet. They will take a little while to dry, and I just suggest laying your card flat and letting it dry overnight just to be sure that they're completely dry before you handle your cards. So here are 3 cards that I created just using different colors. So you can see that this one is using the dark purple and then the lighter purple. So you can see the light purple underneath as well as with the strips there. And then here are the blues that I used from this paper pack. So I have the darker blue and the lighter blue. Again, you can see all of those pretty colors, and you can make a whole bunch of cards using this method and using all of the different colors that are in that paper pad. For my next card, I'm going to show you how you can make this A2 size card using the same background stamp that we used in the previous card. So here I have some Scrapbook.com. These are double-sided adhesive sheets, and I have a piece of white cardstock that I cut down to 2 3/4 by 4 inches, just adding it to the double-sided adhesive sheet so that I can make this a complete sticker on one side. So I'm just using my Scrapbook.com scissors, and I'm just trimming down this cardstock to cut the excess adhesive off. You can see that even though I'm cutting through the adhesive did not stick to these scissors, which I absolutely love. So here I'm going to go ahead and peel back the other side of that sticker sheet, and I cut down all of the color cardstock from that paper pad. So each one of those colors are cut down to 1/2 inch strips, and I'm just putting them there on that sticker sheet in the same order that they are in that paper pad. And I just flip that piece over and I just trim off the excess cardstock on each side, and then I'm going to take that piece of cardstock, put it in my MISTI. I'm just putting some adhesive tape there on the back to hold this piece down, because the stamp is actually larger than the actual piece of cardstock. So I wanted to make sure I had it held down with the adhesive so it didn't move. So I go ahead and add the background stamp, ink it up with the same white pigment ink. I'm just inking up the middle. I don't need to ink up the whole thing. And then I'm going to stamp that down right onto that cardstock. Now with this particular card, I'm not going to do any heat embossing, so there will be no embossing powder. I'm just going to use the lightened image in the background. So I do ink it up just a few times and then press that down really well just to give a little bit darker impression. And because that pigment ink stays wet just a little bit longer, I do take my heat tool and I just run the heat tool over that just to speed up the drying process. So I put that piece back in my MISTI, and I take the Ho 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 sentiment, place it on top just to position it in the center, close the door on my MISTI, and I will ink that up with a dark black ink. This is a VersaFine black ink. And I'm going to go ahead and press that down really well. And I'm going to ink it up one more time and just press that down just to make sure I get a really black impression. So I wanted to soften up the edges of that cardstock layer. So I'm just taking some of the white pigment ink, putting it on my foam dauber there, my ink blending tool. And I'm just inking up the edges, just putting a little bit of white. You can barely see it, but it does soften up the edges just slightly. And to make that panel really stand out, I cut a piece of black cardstock down to 2 7/8 by 4 1/8, and I just put some tape there on the back and add that Ho 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 panel right to the top of that black cardstock. Next, I'm going to take the Scrapbook.com double-sided adhesive foam strips and layer up those strips on the back of that panel just to give it some dimension on top of my A2 size card front. Next, I'm going to take these silver adhesive gems and I'm going to place them on these little dots that are here on the top corner of this stamped image. Also on the little designs, there's some dots that are in the actual words Ho Ho Ho, and I think that just gives it a little bit of sparkle. So I do that for all of those little dots on that card front. So that's how you can use your large background stamp and use it on not only a slimline card, but on a smaller card, in this case an A2 size card. So I'm going to be making one more card with you today, and that is another slimline card using this Snowflake Stencil from Scrapbook.com. I have a piece of black cardstock that I cut down to 3 1/8 by 8 1/8, and I'm going to use some pixie spray and just spray it on the back of my stencil. And the pixie spray will allow it to stick to that cardstock, but it will not rip the cardstock. That's important to know. So it will come off easily, and you don't actually have to apply tape to hold the stencil down. I am, however, putting some Scrapbook.com mint tape at the top of the stencil because when I ink up and apply the ink to the stencil, I want to be sure that the ink does not go past the stencil onto the cardstock. So I'm using it as a mask in this case. So I am using the Scrapbook.com metallic ink. This is also a pigment ink, so it does stay wet just a little bit longer, which again, if you want to handle your cardstock right after, you'll just have to either use a heat tool or just let it sit to the side and then wait for it to dry so that the ink doesn't smear. I did ink up all of those snowflakes. You can see how beautiful that ink looks on that black background. So I'm going to go ahead and place this in my MISTI. And I'm going to bring in the Scrapbook.com vintage type lowercase alphabet stamp set. I am using a powder tool just to put on this cardstock here at the top so that when I do some heat embossing, the embossing powder doesn't stick to it. I am using some of the mint tape just to place a solid line of tape across where the solid black is and then the stencil starts, because I'm trying to line up these letters and I'm just creating my own sentiment. The sentiment is going to be winter wishes, so I'm just putting those down on that cardstock, just trying to make sure that they are straight as they can be, and then I'm going to ink them up with some of the white pigment ink. I'm not using the metallic ink on this portion, I'm using the white pigment ink because I am going to emboss it with the white embossing powder. Now if you wanted to use the metallic ink you could, and you could still do the white embossing on top, no big deal. Because they are both pigment inks, they will still hold the embossing powder. So I sprinkle the white embossing powder right over the top of that sentiment. Probably should have taken that tape off first. Nevertheless, I do end up taking it off before I do the heat embossing. And I do want to mention, try just to sprinkle that embossing powder over top of the sentiment only. If your snowflake is still wet from the ink and you get embossing powder over it, it will stick. So you want to make sure that if you happen to get it on there, that your snowflake is completely dry before doing the embossing. And because I didn't work fast enough trying to switch out these letters and stamp out the sentiment, I had a few gaps where the embossing powder did not stick. So I'm just coming in with a white gel pen and just going over top of it just to kind of fill in those gaps, which is no big deal. I take some of the silver ribbon from my stash and I just cut it down to size. I am going to put it there where the sentiment and the stencil background are separated, and I'm just going to add some of the 1/4 inch Scrapbook.com double-sided tape just to keep that down. And then I'm going to add some of those little silver adhesive gems to all of those little dots on the snowflakes, and I'm going to do it throughout all of those snowflakes just to add some sparkle to this card front. I'm going to take another piece of ribbon and tie it in a bow and just snip off those edges to make them in a diagonal. I will use a glue dot on the back center of that ribbon to attach it to the card front. And then once that's added, I'm going to turn this over and just add some more tape, some more of that double-sided tape to the back of this card layer. Peel off the backing, and I'll add that to one of those Slimline card bases from Scrapbook.com. So again, these are pre-measured and pre-scored Slimline card bases and envelopes. So here is one of the envelopes that also comes with the card bases in the 10 pack. And I'm just taking that snowflake stencil and some black ink, and I'm just stenciling on some snowflakes onto the envelope. I'm also using some of the Scrapbook.com mint tape, and I'm just using it as a mask here so that I don't get ink on the envelope where I don't want it. You can see how that ink, when I go over that stencil, it actually appears on that mint tape. If I didn't have that tape there, it would actually be on the white part of the envelope, and I definitely don't want that. So here I'm just moved the stencil over and added some more stenciling to the opposite side of the envelope, and then I saw that there was this big white space that's just this gap here, so I'm just going to mask off just one of the snowflakes here, stencil that on, and here is my matching envelope. Isn't that pretty? So hopefully I've given you some ideas on some winter or Christmas themed cards. Product links will be down in the description box, and up close pictures of all of these cards will be on my blog at lisamearsdesigns.com. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe for more card making inspiration. Thanks so much for watching and have a great day. Bye-bye.